here. We wanted to do a very sort of in-depth look at movie theaters because they are clearly sitting on the brink. I think that goes without fucking, without saying that that they're clearly in dire straits at the moment. So we wanted to take some time to actually take a look at exactly how they got there and what the future might actually hold. So without further ado, where I want to kind of start is theaters altogether, and I'm going to try to kind of blow through this a little bit. So how movie theaters sort of how we got here with theaters is that way back in the 1890s, there was something called the phanoscope that led to what was called the vitascope, which was Thomas Edison. That was essentially like I guess his creation, because I think the phonoscope was. Our phanoscope was sold to Thomas Edison, and he made modifications, yada yada, boring stuff. But then that led to the Vitascope Hall, which hall as well as the Vitascope Theater. Now that's kind of laying the groundwork for theaters as we know them today. In the 1900s, or not that in the 1900s or whatever you call them. The first permanent motion picture theater in the state of California was Tally's Electric Theater in 1902 in LA. Okay, we move from there to 1905, where we have the opening of the storefront. Or in a storefront, and this is essentially like what the Nickelodeon theaters are, which were the first sort of common type of theater, which were these Nickelodeon theaters, and then that jumps to the 1910s, which because of the success of Birth of a Nation, which kind of established the role of feature films. Theaters became a lot more popular, and that was around 1915, even though Birth of a Nation is a racist piece of shit of a movie. So then we jump to the 1920s and beyond, where basically independent promoters and movie studios essentially, and this is going to be actually pretty key because we're going to talk about this a little later, but independent promoters and movie studios race to build sort of like the most extravagant or lavish theaters that they could in order to get people to come and put their asses in the seats. So this led to movie palaces, and then the movie palaces led to sort of the theaters as we know them today, because that led to multiplexes, which then led to megaplexes, which a lot of the places we see right now are multiplexes. But in that span of time between the 1920s and now, what happened is that, and I'll just read verbatim here, several movie studios achieve vertical integration by acquiring and constructing theater chains, meaning that basically they just owned the entire process of making the film, from the development to the actual, when people are actually sitting down to watch a movie, they owned every single aspect of it. But what that did was that basically made it a super fucking clusterfuck of a monopoly of they just owned every fucking aspect of it, so they could make the movie for as much as they want, they could charge for as much as they want, and nobody could really say jack shit about it, because what else are you going to do? So that led to the that was sort of like popularized by what's called the Big Five. So that's Paramount, Warner, Lowe's, which I think owned MGM, as well as Fox, and then it's now defunct, but back then RKO. So they were all broken up because the Supreme Court essentially ruled in 1948 in a kind of a dispute with Paramount that they can't own every single part of it, and so that was essentially like an antitrust case. So I say all that to fucking say that's how we sort of got the theater chains as we know them today. So.
And I do want to throw one thing out there when we look at like the history of movie theaters and where we are today, right? Because like there's a bit of time that we skipped over, and for any listeners who know about this particular point in time, I do want to acknowledge it, right? So, like, first of all, huge shout out to Canada. Canada has really, really led the way in the development of like the motion picture industry and like the theater experience as like we now have it today. So they were like one of the first countries in the world to like have dedicated motion picture viewing theaters. I think Canada was the first country in the world to have like a theater with multiple screens to where there are two films showing at any particular time. And I also think Canada was one of the first countries in the world to like launch the more like luxury style cinemas and movie theaters that are like have become increasingly popular since 2010. So huge shout out there. Also drive-in movie theaters. I think that was a really crucial point in both the accessibility and like the pleasure of going to see a movie, right? That really changed the nature of how people could and why people would go to the movie theaters. So I think that was a huge point in time for movie theaters, which ultimately led us to where we are today. Drive-in movie theaters is still a thing. I think there are I think there were like 400 still remaining in the United States today. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna have to double check that, but it was a prominent part in the theater or the movie theater experience, especially in American history. So I didn't want to skip over that. I wanted to acknowledge that, but we really want to talk about the nature of films today.
Yeah, absolutely. And to just add just a smidge bit more to that, so it's just like, theaters are just like anything else that can be reproduced, right? Like where you start off with one and then it's great. And then that turns to two and then that's great. And then you're like, okay, well, like let's start a chain of these. And then that's how we get the chains as we have them today. They were no different than, what they call, I think the McDonaldization of business, right? Like you just create a formula that works and then you rinse and repeat for everything else. And so that's what theaters have done, especially some of the big chain theaters. Now, that's what gets us to where we're at today. Obviously, the coronavirus, fucking chaos as far as markets go for literally everything. No matter what industry you're in, you're definitely affected by this one way or another. Nobody's nobody's immune to it. Everybody has to deal with, the coronavirus, this COVID-19 in one shape or another. So obviously that's going to affect the theater industry pretty significantly, because not only do people have to come into tight spaces, relatively tight spaces, and sit down next to other people for long stretches of time while everybody coughs and sneezes, and the seats I'm sure aren't too sanitized and things like that, but also the actual creation of the actual movies, right? If you don't have movies to actually show, then you don't have a product to actually show people. So that's what forced the theaters, and we're going to talk specifically about the big theater chains, to essentially shut down business. Now, the big dog in the game, let's just, take it off top, is AMC, right? AMC is the big dog in the yard right now, as far as being, the biggest theater chain. Right now it has 659 sites, right? So let's dissect where they're currently at and see if they're going to be viable to continue moving forward. So just in March, their stock declined 50%. That was just in March. So some news broke out like maybe a week or two ago that they were likely to file for bankruptcy, which is understandable because they currently right now have $4.75 billion worth of debt. Now, you might say, okay, well, what do they have, right? As far as like any sort of like revenue or cash or whatever the case is, right? They have $265 million in cash and equivalents on hand, plus $332 million available via lines of credit as of December 31st, 2019. So that's as of December 31st, 2019. That was before coronavirus. That was before COVID-19 actually like hit and shut everything down. So
when you hear that money, it sounds like a lot, right? But when you're looking at a company the size of AMC that has operations in almost every state in the United States, multiple locations, a huge overhead in terms of staffing, that money is going to burn quickly.
Well, not only is it going to burn quickly, but they're $4.75 billion in debt. That's, if you're unfamiliar with how much $1 billion is, maybe you should familiarize yourself, because that money that they have on hand, and that they have maybe via lines of credit and shit, they ain't gonna get the job done. So AMC, and you can tell they're definitely in trouble, because they informed their landlords, and we were talking about it a little bit before we came on, when we spent the 5 hours trying to get the audio to work. We were talking about, I remember mentioning that the landlords the AMC told their landlords that, that rent payment.
It's going to be super late. Don't even look for it, because it won't be coming.
Yeah, don't look for Venmo. Don't look for a check in the mail. Don't look for a goddamn thing. It ain't coming.
One thing I want to throw in there. So at the moment, financial analysts are projecting that AMC has, like, between the cash that they have on hand, between the line of credit that they have enough cash and credit to stay liquid until about June or July of this year. That's literally right around the corner.
Yeah. So that's right around the corner. But some other news came out just like a day or two ago, that they're actually getting $500 million in new debt to stay afloat, not just through June or July, but through November. Hopefully that they can, kind of weather the storm until then, and they can see sort of where things stand. So AMC is sitting in a very terrible spot, because they're highly over leveraged, and they aren't going to have an income for the foreseeable future. And we're expecting, okay, maybe by June, July, things will open back up. Okay, we'll get some movies back in there. But there are just so many different factors that are preventing that from being the case. For one, we don't know by June or July if everything is going to be back to normal, right? In fact, I could almost tell you for a certainty that it definitely won't be, right? Like, people are like, schools are planning, okay, like, how are you going to conduct the school year? The school year doesn't start until late August, early September, right? Schools know that this shit is not going to be over by then. So not only that, but they need the product to actually put in theaters. And if you're a studio, you're super fucking hesitant to say that, okay, we're going to release our movies come, the beginning of July, or come August or whatever. You're super hesitant about that, because you don't know. Like, you don't know if people are actually going to get out and come out specifically to the theaters. Like, it's different if you say people are going to go out to, like, the beaches and shit. That's completely different than saying, sit in this theater where you're breathing the same air as everybody else, and you're touching that fucking seat that everybody else has coughed and sneezed on and shit. And we don't know if the coronavirus is gone yet, and we don't have a vaccine yet. So good luck. Like, no, I mean, I like Black Widow. I don't like Black Widow that much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, one of the reports I read says that, like, and we'll dive a little bit more into this when we start talking about some of the other chains, is that some movie theaters like Cinemark are projecting an opening in July. To your point, we don't know that yet. Like, projections don't really mean shit at this point. It really is going to focus. What's going to determine when the country reopens and when businesses like movie theater reopens is how this virus acts. Like, if the weather warms up and we see people start to spend more time outdoors and people keep coming into contact with each other and infection rates continue to rise, theaters are not going to open. If we're on the downside of the bell curve, we may see theaters open in like mid June, early July, but we don't know.
Yeah, we don't. And so let's get to our predictions when we wrap this thing up. But let's blow through this really quick. So Regal Cinema, which is the next in line as far as like size, they have about 558 sites. They actually are owned by what's called Cineworld, which, the one thing that they have to do when they get back into like when everything turns back to normal is change all these fucking names. You got Cineworld, you got Cinemark, you got Cin this and that. Just come on, just anybody be creative. But I'm sorry.
Let's rebrand. Okay. Yeah, when we come out of this thing, I hope some of these theaters say, hey, maybe now's or some of these, like the companies that own these major movie theaters think that like now's the time we not only rebrand, but also maybe rethink the dynamic of like how the theaters are set up.
Yeah,
Because I
they
don't want to
have
be
to.
sitting next to anybody.
Well, they have to. They have to. They have to absolutely think that. But Cineworld just now they're sitting in a very precarious position because they just reached an agreement back, I think, in December with Cineplex, which is a Canadian theater chain, and so that doesn't bode well because obviously, everybody's fucked right now. So, so they don't even know if that acquisition is going to go through. And if it does, then they're even doubly fucked because now they have whatever the debt was of the Cineplex, which might not make that deal happen. But just to give you an idea, so Cineworld, which again owns Regal Cinema, its stock fell about 76% in the first half of March. 76%. Fuck. And they're $3.6 billion in debt. Yikes. So yeah, they don't seem like they're sitting in a good spot. Cinemark Theaters, which is again the third biggest chain here in the US, has about 525 sites, and their stock price fell by 68% in the first half of March, and they're about $3.4 billion in debt. They're also raising another $250 million through an underwritten loan debt offering.
Cinemark seems to be like the only chain that is operating with a bit of optimism, right? Like again, AMC is facing bankruptcy. Cinemark, they're hoping to have theaters or some locations open by July 1st by implementing some like social distancing practices in their theaters. Christopher Nolan's Tenet is slated for release, I believe, like the July 17th.
Yeah, that shit ain't coming out.
You don't think so?
No, fuck no.
Yeah. So what they're hoping is that they're able to have theaters open during that time for the release of some of these like larger films that are set to release in summer and towards the back end of the year. I just don't know if that happens, man.
Yeah, I don't know either. Okay, so there are a couple other theaters I want to talk about, but let's skip those. There's Marcus Theaters and then Landmark Theaters, but I think those are small enough that they can be. Everybody gets the picture by now, right? So let's talk about reopening, right? We talked about them reopening. So they got some news this past week. Donald Trump announced Thursday, I think it was this past Thursday, that cinemas might slowly be able to reopen in the coming months. Now it's Donald Trump, so you take that for whatever the fuck it's worth. But should cinemas successfully reopen, or at least in parts of the, they're expecting maybe only parts of the country that they'll actually reopen, some parts that aren't so hit by the COVID virus, and they're expecting that by July. And so what they're hoping to do is to like play movies that aren't as affected by like international markets, right? So like comedies tend to do well, and they tend to be low budget, or at least lower budget than some of the other films. So yeah, if you want to hop up, I can
keep going.
Yeah. So yeah, you've got they're going to open with these comedies because they sort of are better to bank on than and these other high ticket movies that you don't know if they're going to succeed or not, and a lot less riskier, obviously, and so but what that does is it makes it questionable on if people are actually going to come back out to the theaters, right? Because are you going to risk everything to go see fucking like Girls Trip 2, which I don't think it's going to come out this particular year, obviously, but it's like I wouldn't risk my fucking health to go see a fucking comedy. It's like I'll just catch it on VOD. It's fine, at least that's me. But I don't know if the world, much less the US, is ready for that. And then the Trump administration, basically even before this whole thing took place, there were rumblings that they could try to reverse that Paramount case that we mentioned earlier in the conversation, that they could essentially lift a decree that that studios couldn't own the theaters in order to be able to kind of save the theaters, right? So that might happen if they decide that that this is pretty much too far gone to save. So that presents two specific scenarios. That presents the scenario of either A, if everybody will remember in 2008, 2009, when the auto industry was bailed out, right? That one of the things is I think that that the federal government then kind of took ownership, at least a certain percentage ownership in the companies. There's rumblings that could possibly happen, right? That they could bail out the theaters and then take ownership in some, maybe some sort of stake in the theaters themselves. But I don't see the government doing that. I just don't. I think the theater industry is just too kind of fickle to, and it's kind of dying. And it's the auto industry. You can kind of see that because that's a necessity, right? Like you need to drive a fucking car, right? And you need cars to sell. Or at least maybe some climate people would firmly disagree with that. But
and I mean, there's so many other industries that rely on that. But to your point, like the movie theater industry, is that like coming out of this pandemic, is that a huge priority for the government? And would a large enough portion of the population even be okay with like the government doing a movie theater bailout when there are clearly going to be a lot of other ways to spend that money?
100%.
I don't think a significant amount of U.S. population is going to be for that. Let's spend billions of dollars to bail out movie theaters. Coming out of this, we're going to want to see that money go to hospitals and rethinking like healthcare, right? So I don't see it happening.
Yeah, no, I don't see that happening either. But then the other scenario is that they do lift this decree that they can basically that studios can essentially own the theaters and have that full sort of vertical dynamic where they own the distribution of the movie, but then they also own where they actually get distributed at, right? Which, so in that scenario, okay, well then Disney and fucking Comcast is going to own literally everything, and there's not going to be any in between, right? Because they're damn sure not going to show movies from competitors at their theaters, and they're the only game in town that ideally could buy up, some of these theaters and be able to sort of carry that. So then that's looking extremely unappetizing, and I think that would be a dark fucking time for movies, period, if that were to take place. But let's go ahead and wrap this up by giving just our predictions or what we think is important. Saying all that, I would say that it comes down to two things. It comes down to the big ticket movies, the tentpole films, and then it comes down to people willing to go out. It comes down to the big ticket movies because I guarantee you, and I already see some of the studios sort of like playing it a little fast and loose with some of the not so big movies, but big enough where it's like, this is crazy. Like we had, I think it was a Paddington 2 that came out on VOD, or it wasn't Paddington 2. It might have been Paddington 2.
Trolls.
Trolls.
Well, I think that was the first big anticipated film to just go with a strictly VOD release.
Yeah. And so as we sort of go on, and I'm guaranteed this is exactly how the fuck it's going to play out. You hear me now, quote me later. As we approach June and July, if we're still talking about this being a thing, like not necessarily going away, that where everybody's still quarantining, somebody's going to flinch. One of the studios is going to flinch, and somebody's going to release a big fucking ticket movie early. It might not be as big of a ticket movie. Like, so for instance, I can imagine like New Mutants from what was then Fox, but now is Disney, of course. I can see that being released because they have, to my knowledge, they haven't actually set a date for when that is supposed to release. So I think that they're holding the smaller movies like that, the bigger top ticket movies, they are giving us clear definitions about, right? Like, so we know Black Widow's coming out in November. We know Bond is coming out in November. So movies like that, Fast and Furious, we know is coming out 2021. Like we know that shit. But some of the movies that are like the in-betweens, that's the ones that they're going to try to like.
Yes. Have they announced a release date for Wonder Woman 2? Or what?
No,
because I think it was just delayed.
Yeah, I don't think they have. I'm not sure. Let me while you
So,
yeah,
and I'll give my predictions here, but I think Wonder Woman 2, because they have it, like, for example, they've pulled Black Widow, and they've pushed it back and given it a new release date. As far as I understand, Wonder Woman 2, they've just announced that they're not going to be releasing it in theaters. Of course, why? Because movie theaters are closed. I think that could be a really important film that might dictate where this thing lands, right? If Wonder Woman, it's in the DC universe. Who owns DC? Is it like, I don't know who owns DC.
I think DC, at least to my knowledge, I thought it was like just DC.
Independently owned.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say DC decides to say, "Hey, we're going to go with a streaming release for Wonder Woman. We're going to do it in May. We're going to do it in June." I think we're going to see a lot of the other companies start to fall in line and just start to maybe bump up their release dates to maybe not November or December, but you might see movies start to hit in August and September. So I'm going to be watching for Wonder Woman. I think that might be a huge indicator, but I think the super megaplex theaters as we know them today, like, these AMC movie theaters that maybe have like 12, 16, 18 different theater rooms that are showing these films.
Yeah, those are definitely gone.
I think that's dead. I think what a lot of these theaters are going to do is maybe keep these like facilities that have 12, that have these like multiple screening rooms, but eliminate half of the seating in every room, right? Or in every theater. Go with a more luxury style seating, right? More larger, bigger, more comfortable seats where you can be served food and drinks. That may allow them to recoup what they're going to lose in seating, but maybe start to charge a little bit more. Like, again, if you're able to buy food and alcohol and have a more, they're probably going to brand it as like a more lucrative luxury film experience, right? But I really can't see this industry getting bailed out like we talked about. What I do think will survive are like the smaller mom and pop local theaters that may have like 2 or 3 different theater rooms that show very particular niche movies, maybe like classic movies, or again, just smaller theatrical releases. I do think they'll survive. And if you want to go in on one, let's do that, because I think they're going to be dirt cheap, but I think they'll survive.
Yep. I think my prediction is, look, either the theaters go to the studios. So either the Trump administration allows for the theaters to allow them to be owned by, the movie studios that produce the movies. But because I could just see them doing something crazy like that. Or now the theaters have to start thinking in VOD game, VOD game. Like you got to start thinking video on demand. And that's an awful thing to say because of the amount of people that actually work for the theaters and, are employed by them. But I just don't see how, like, I don't see it, dude. Like these numbers are crazy. I just told you all the debt that all of these theaters are in. I think it's a collective like $15-20 billion that they're in debt with no income. And they were doing pretty shitty beforehand as well. So unless somebody comes in and, swoops in and kind of saves the day, which in case they do want a stake in the actual theaters, I don't see it, dude. Like, and all this is to say, we don't know when the fuck we're gonna all be able to go back, if we even want to go back to the theaters, So I think it's a grim time ahead for the theaters, and I feel terribly about it, because I love going to the theaters. I love, the smell of it, the feel of it, the excitement of it, of watching the trailers, sitting in the seat, getting comfy, thinking about, oh man, what's going to, what is this thing going to be? It's a truly special experience. And being somebody who, have a film podcast, as well as, I try to, dabble in, writing films and shit like that and make it on my own. Yeah, it's a sad fucking time, but at the same time, you have to be somewhat, realistic with what the fuck's actually going on and what the next step is. What is the path forward? But with all that fucking being said, I think we have done our service for the day. I think we have given the people some good time, some good content. But now it is time to get the fuck out of here. I know you got some shit to do. I've got some shit to catch up on, like sleep.
Yeah. For anybody who did listen to today's podcast, I think this is an ongoing conversation, particularly about like the future of the film industry and movie theaters. So if you have any thoughts, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, reach out to us on social media, on Instagram or Twitter at The Fade Podcast. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Like maybe there's a angle that we didn't touch base on yet. Maybe there's like some news that we're just not privy to at the moment. If you have anything, again, any comments or ideas, reach out to us on social media. We'd love to continue the conversation.
Sounds great. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you listening, especially if you listen through